Welcome back, Happy New Year, Fragrance Fiend here today, kicking off Season 3 with a huge one. It was voted #1 by you guys on Fragrantica, part of the Community Awards. It is Oud Maracuja by Maison Crivelli. It was also ranked #4 for the top men's, and funnily enough, it was actually the only niche fragrance in that top 10 category, well, if you count PDM as niche. So in all honesty, I'm actually so surprised to see this at #1. I remember when Oud Maracuja came out, I was actually going to buy it, but a few other fragrances at the time took away my interest from it, so I never ended up buying it, and I never really had the urge to. And looking back, I'm kinda glad I didn't, as from here on out, it's probably going to be worn by absolutely everyone with the press it's going to be getting, or publicity I should say. So starting off, it was actually released in 2023, it falls under the woody, fruity category, and it is none other than an extrait de parfum, obviously a concentration which is becoming very popular nowadays, everybody wants their extracts, and it sits at a very high 32% concentration. For those who don't know, generally the rule of thumb is the higher the concentration, the longer it lasts, and the more it projects. And really, it's a case-by-case basis. I've had quite a few eau de toilettes outlast at least a few of my extracts. Anyway, beside all that, I absolutely love Maison Crivelli. They have some really experimental and adventurous scents. I like how a lot of them do take a tiny bit of a left turn to the name. You might see what it's called, and it may take you down a different path, and this is no exception. As this one is called Oud Maracuja, Maracuja obviously translating to passion fruit, and to me it honestly does take me down a tiny bit more of a leathery route, but we'll get into that shortly. The perfumer has a very extensive resume. They've worked on about 145 different fragrances, but none have really captured the attention of the majority quite like this one. And to be honest, I'm really surprised to see an oud fragrance at the top of the charts. And I think from here on out, this is probably going to spark off a massive influx of oud fragrances, probably like 2026, 27, simply because you can't really mass produce fragrances that quickly. It does take a long time to actually make them. So are we entering a new era? Well, let's get into the note breakdown. Now, it does list key raw materials. They include passion fruit, saffron, Turkish rose, benzoin, oud accord, cistus, leather, patchouli oil, vanilla, and akigalawood. The one thing I find quite interesting is that these are listed as raw materials. Obviously, you can't really distill passion fruit, nor turn actual leather into a perfume oil through natural means. You can obviously recreate it using headspace technology or purely synthetic ingredients. I wouldn't necessarily call it a true raw ingredient, which then takes me to the oud accord. I have a feeling there might be a very small potential concentration of real oud, but primarily mixed in with synthetics. But let's have a whiff. I absolutely love that opening. The passion fruit dominates this fragrance, as you expect, and this is what I believe the general public fall in love with when they smell Oud Maracuja. It's that passion fruit which makes or breaks it for most people, and it's such a different approach to many other oud fragrances. I think most of us do remember in 2021 when Xerjoff launched the Tony Iommi Monkey Special, which quite heavily featured the notes of pineapple with a very oud-like base, but more on the boozier side, not using an official note of oud. Even though they are quite opposite, the passion fruit does kind of align them in that leathery fruity territory. Could Oud Maracuja have been inspired by this? I don't really know. So as I mentioned, a very beautiful passion fruit in the opening, quite fruity. I almost get a tiny bit of a touch of citrus as well, like either mandarin, orange, blood orange to be in particular. What I don't get the truest sense of is the oud. I definitely get a lot more leather in contrast, and those woods, and a hint of jamminess and sweetness from the Turkish rose. Could this be another approach of Maison Crivelli where they take a bit of a left turn and it's not necessarily what you expect? I mean, they could have, but in contrast to Oud Stallion, that one is a lot more leathery than this, but you definitely get that blend of resinous benzoin and a hint of oud providing the backbone. Obviously, if you've smelt real oud before, or a lot of traditional Middle Eastern houses which produce oud fragrances, you're going to call this one a tiny bit more of a safer fragrance, even though to the vast majority out there, you'd consider this something a lot more for an advanced wearer. But in the whole world of oud, it's definitely a little more on the lighter side. Even when I compare it to my bottle of Luxor by Xerjoff, this is a heavy-hitting oud fragrance. Or take King Blue or Silver Oud, if I remember the name correctly, by Amouage. They are absolutely deadly. Even though I do believe Oud Maracuja is a little more on the safer side, I wouldn't really call it as safe as some of MFK's ouds, and I'm not going to whip out my bottle of Royal Oud right now, which is in my cabinet, but I really do think it kind of meets at a middle ground for entry-level oud wearers wanting to wear something a little more experimental, but not necessarily experimental enough for people who've really worn true oud before. It really does meet that level of accessibility. I mean, as you can tell, this is the #1 voted niche fragrance of 2024. Of course, it's going to be accessible if that many people are voting for it. Now that the top notes are beginning to evaporate a bit, the passion fruit definitely dies off after probably the first half an hour, if not earlier, and then the depth starts to creep in a tiny bit more. It definitely goes into that more earthier territory given the patchouli oil, while also keeping that level of sweetness from the vanilla. The oud and vanilla definitely sit in the background and don't overtake the fragrance any step of the way. To me, at least on my skin, it's really that leather and blend of rose, with the woods as well, which really define this fragrance throughout the progression of the dry down. Rewinding back to the opening though, the fragrance definitely gives off this very thick texture, something which you wouldn't be able to pull off in summer as it is quite demanding, and And I always like to think of a bit of a scent bubble or cloud when you're wearing a fragrance. Is it very thin, light, fresh, or is it more thick? And obviously the more sweeter or heavier you go, the less likely you will want to wear something like that in deep humidity or summer. Just because even though as nice as your fragrance may be, the humidity can really disrupt those natural oils and make them smell quite gross. Another quick respritz. I also get a very small hint of pineapple, without it making it sound like an insult, because I mean it in the most genuine way. It's almost as if you let apple juice get a tiny bit warm. And I mean that in the most pleasant way possible. Overall, projection-wise, it is well above average. You're gonna smell like a bomb for at least about 8-9 hours before it really dives down to a skin scent, and then the longevity, I mean, on your clothing, it will last for a few days, which really puts it up there to be quite competitive in terms of performance. As for the audience, it's so hard to pinpoint this because it does kind of smell like something someone in their 30s and above would wear, but the teenage crowds are really craving this stuff now. You'd be surprised with 15-year-olds buying bottles of red tobacco and Creed. Spending $300, $400, $500 on a bottle of perfume. It is a serious fragrance that does mean business. I really don't think maybe a teenage audience is probably best wearing this, because it could off-put potential partners. I mean, it's not really the most accessible scent. I would not say this one is suitable for the workplace, at least in the Western world, while being a bit too heavy for a date night scent. And as far as the versatility goes, you're really quite limited to winter, or maybe a cool spring night, but otherwise this one can definitely be quite intrusive to the sensitive nose. So please spray with caution. Don't be one of those people, trust me, I've seen people do this before, where they go up to Oud Maracuja and spray themselves 12 to 15 times on every pulse point on their body. Don't be like that, unless you're trying to keep people away from you. So the latest Oud fragrance from the brand, Oud Cadenza, barely fell into the top 50, while Oud Stellion, the follow-up to Maracuja, just missed out on the top 50. So I can definitely imagine Maison Crivelli doing a yearly Oud fragrance. I mean, they have for the past few years now. It always seems to end up as a Harrods exclusive until the rest of the world gets it about a year later. Australia only got Stellion probably about 6 months ago, and I don't think we're anywhere on the radar for Cadenza, but I could be long, or Cadenza. But overall, I do like the fragrance, not as much as Tony Iommi. I feel like the passion fruit is a little more refined in this one, and I generally prefer the more boozier elements that come along with this, with the rum. The leather element is a little more lighter, whereas Maracuja is just not a scent for me. That being said, I am pleasantly surprised that it was number 1, not what I expected. I think it's really going to push the boundaries of even designer brands. I mean, they do take note of what's popular, what people are voting for, and they're going to try and replicate that any way they can. So I think by this poll, it's probably going to have a massive impact on the industry, because there's nothing quite like this that's been voted as number 1 or even in the top 5 before. But anyway, that's all for episode 1 of season 3. Thank you so much again for watching. I'll see you next time.